Now, I said that I was going to get specific, and let me do so, because I said I want to help to try to find whatever it is that is the opposite of a public intellectual. The person who, as I say, throws out a claim and then doesn't bother to defend it. There are three examples I'll give, three people I'll give as examples, but the first is perhaps my favorite. I discovered while I was speaking yesterday that Robin DAngelo had spoken at the university last year, and so I was especially interested to know what she said. Robin DAngelo is the author of a book called White Fragility that was sold by the hundreds of thousands, he says enviously, but it was unbelievable, the piles of this book that were in every bookshop in America. A White Fragility was, I submit, a sort of bomb-throwing exercise by DAngelo, but one that has had extraordinary consequences on the public discourse in America. She wrote a second book, came out last year, called Nice Racism. It's a very, very bizarre book, which, among other things, makes the claim that there has been no progress in racial relations in America from 1950 until now, which is all the data shows that's flat out wrong. But this is the sort of thing she does. Now, but I wanted to give an example because she very, very, very rarely gives herself up for interview. And she never, ever debates. She will not debate in public, anyone. Countless attempts to try to persuade her to do so, and she just won't do it. I'll give an example of why I think that might be. She did do an interview in 2018 for Christian Amanpour's show. It wasn't actually Amanpour who was interviewing her, it was Michelle Martin, distinguished black female journalist, who interviewed Robin DAngelo and was clearly struck by the oddity and extremism of some of DAngelo's claims. And doing her job as an interviewer, Martin quoted a part of DAngelo's work where DAngelo had said that white people find racism, quote, exciting and enjoy, quote, indulging in it. So Martin said to DAngelo, why do you say that? You're a scholar. Where's your data? What makes you say that? These are all very good questions. This is DAngelo's answer, quote, there is a kind of glee in the white collective when black bodies are punished. I'm still getting over what an extraordinary thing that is to say. What a horrible thing it is to say. And and it's just important for everyone who studies rhetoric, the sheer bizarreness of being thrown an extraordinary claim that you have been making in public, being asked for the evidence for it, and in response, making a more extraordinary and impossible to prove claim. But that was Robin DAngelo. As I say, I submit that she almost certainly doesn't put herself up for public debate because she couldn't survive public debate, because any American could say to her, evidence for my own life, every bit of data that's available. But as I say, the impact of her work has been very considerable. There's two other people I wanted to mention quickly. One is Nicole Hannah-Jones, who weirdly enough started attacking me on social media today. But Nicole Hannah-Jones is the author of the 1619 Project. And I do a critique of that project in this book, partly because I say, again, there are very extraordinary claims being thrown out in this project, which if it hadn't got the imprint of the New York Times, I think wouldn't have got the attention it has now had. The 1619 Project makes repeated assertions which it cannot prove. Let me give a quick example. Hannah-Jones and her colleagues say, well, we have so many historians involved. Actually, a lot of the people they gave the work to were, for instance, sociologists. I apologize if there are any sociologists here. But they give the job of damning capitalism to a sociology professor of very little repute, it has to be said, who writes a chapter in the 1619 Project saying that when an American worker sits down at their office desk today, if you can imagine an American worker going into an office anymore, when an American worker goes into their office and sits down at their computer, they are engaging in a system of recording and thinking that has a direct link to the plantation system. His evidence for this is a book that he cites that doesn't say what he has just said that it says. And he simply says, well, there was a system of recording, accurate recording on plantations. And that is the sort of thing that's still going on in American offices. Okay. Well, the second bit is true. It's true that systems that are accurate are likely to survive better than ones that are entirely made up. But this claim, of course, entirely ignores, first of all, the fact that the plantation system was obviously a sort of horrible feudal system. And secondly, that the kind of record keeping he's talking about goes back to ancient Babylon. It's an extraordinary claim to make. But as I say, it's become a very normal thing. You want to do over capitalism? You want to say that for the free market system's awful? Best way to do it is to get a sociologist to find a way to say that it's racist, and then job done. And that's a considerable amount of what the 1619 Project has done. It has.
You know, what Douglas is actually pointing out is the cowardice that exists on the far left and the left in general. Most of them do not want to engage in any type of constructive dialogue. They do not want to involve in any kind of a discussion or debate, the substance of the debate. They want to basically throw their incendiary bombs, their verbal assaults, literally, onto people or onto corporations or onto entities, whatever's out there in the public or even the private sphere. And they throw these from a long distance away so that when the explosion occurs, they're far away from it. And if in defense, somebody tries to bring up the fact that this verbal incendiary was tossed, well, they crawl back into their cave and they basically shout out, racist, bigot, that's prejudiced, you're a blank phobe. And that's how they're able to sort of squash or at least try to minimize the rebuttal that will be coming their way. It's just like the incendiary remarks that are made. It was like when Barack Obama was president. If you criticize him, the left said, it's because you're racist. You criticize a policy of his, you're racist, you're bigoted. And it's a very effective tool to shut some people down. It really, really is. To shut them down. Because most people are then get afraid of what's going to come after them, whether it's on social media, whether it's from, the drive-by networks, right? And then you have a drive-by verbal assault that's going on from the alphabet networks. And then, there's a Twitterverse. And then there's doxing, and then there's all kinds of things. And a lot of people, they just don't want to get involved in that at all. And then there's a cancel culture. You toss that on top of it. And some people, they don't have the means to do that because it could be the loss of a job. It could be a loss of a career. It could be a whole bunch of things because everybody's against you. You literally have the world coming against you nowadays. Look what's happening with, DEI, which I like to call DIE. And all the corporations that are, grabbing onto this political correctness crap that's going out there. So when Douglas is pointing out, DAngelo and with Hannah Jones and these others, it's all softball questions. Nobody comes in, or if you do come in with a particular question, they don't answer it. They double down on what they were saying before and continue to go with that. Ibrahim X. Kendi is another great example of this. But slowly and slowly, light is the biggest form of disinfectant that's out there in terms of truth. The truth eventually will win out, but in the meantime, it's you've really got to have the attitude and the intestinal fortitude to basically stick it out and say, you know what? All right, keep on coming. I don't care. Call me a racist. You know what? You're a pedophile. Call me a bigot. You ought to stop, chasing after, kids. You better stop doing that. Or if I'm a racist, then you're a racist. Just toss it right back at them. That is the way to deal with these cowards in the public arena. Anyways, folks, you're watching the Dr. Nasir Shaikh Show, and it's Douglas Murray giving a talk at the University of North Carolina. I'm giving my political prescription from my political perspective. What happens when Douglas Murray sits down for a speech and starts talking about free speech and the cowardice of the left, because they're not like the past intellectuals that would stand up and would debate and would, tackle these issues and verbally spar with each other and walk away from it still friends. Doesn't happen anymore. Anyways, let's get to more of the debate. More of Douglas Murray's speech right now.
I repeat, because there's a pattern here, the authors will not debate in public. The originators of the project refuse to debate historians. They occasionally will say, well, I'm not a historian myself, and I don't want to debate with this. The truth is that if you put any of the authors of the 1619 project up against an American historian like Gene Yarborough, Alan Gelzo, they wouldn't survive the discussion, because these scholars would say, I'm sorry, what you're saying is just inaccurate, untrue. Let me give a third example, because it's a particularly egregious one, and it has to do with, as I say, Jefferson, who I spent a significant amount of this week thinking about. Ibram X. Kendi wrote another very, very best-selling book a few years ago called How to Be an Anti-Racist, which had enormous impact. Was one of the most widely cited books in people's workplaces when people started passing around, lists of books that you had to read to make yourself a better person. This book almost always featured on such lists alongside DAngelo's. Now, I read the book because I have this very old-fashioned notion that you should read books if you're going to criticize them. A habit that I can assure you is not ever shared by my critics. But I can tell you also, with any writers or would-be writers around here, never pretend you've read a book to the author if you haven't read it. The author knows immediately. I can assure you, when I was on the other side of it, I thought, oh, I'll never do that again. Something in the eyes, very hard to define. But anyway, I actually did read Ibram X. Kendi's book, and I thought it was interesting. But the main thing I thought was extraordinary about it was, again, a set of extraordinary assertions are thrown out and then not backed up by evidence. DAngelo, for instance, refers, any of you who are scholars of Hume will know that in the work of David Hume, the great Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, there is one footnote in one of his essays which all Hume scholars are deeply embarrassed by, don't know what to do with, acknowledges there, is undoubtedly racist, and is strange, among other things, because it goes against all of the rest of Hume's thought. Kendi only refers to this when he refers to Hume in his work, as if all of Hume is this footnote, and as if he has discovered it in a nightly reading of the collected works of David Hume. And he goes on to make the same attack on Thomas Jefferson as he's just done on David Hume, and this is how he does it. He says, I'm quoting Kendi directly, he says, Thomas Jefferson was at fault because, quote, Thomas Jefferson never made the anti-racist declaration. Now, first of all, the anti-racist declaration is a declaration written by Ibram X. Kendi in 2019. It is not Thomas Jefferson's fault that he failed to make the anti-racist declaration demanded of people in 2019 by Ibram X. Kendi. It's a historical fallacy. It's like saying, why are there no cell phones in movies about the 18th century? Well, the iPhone wasn't there then. It's the most basic sort of historical fallacy to fall into. Anyhow, he says Thomas Jefferson never made the anti-racist declaration. And he then goes on to quote Jefferson saying, as an evidence of Jefferson's racism, he quotes Jefferson saying, it would be hazardous to affirm that the racial groups are equal. Now, what he doesn't do, and of course, when I read this, I thought this is such a strange quote. I'll look up where he's got it from. Kendi's got it from a book about racism and the founding fathers. So first of all, again, he has not been reading through the collected letters of Thomas Jefferson and just stumbled upon it. He is quoting a book about racism. He almost certainly hasn't actually gone and even done the basic thing that the students among you will know you should do, which is you go to the source. You just go to the source. On this occasion, the source is a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Marquis de Chastellux in 1785. The Marquis was a friend of his from France, obviously, and it's a very interesting letter, it turns out, and says exactly the opposite of what Kennedy suggests that the letter says. And I'll quote to you what exactly it is that Jefferson says in this letter. He's musing about an issue, and this is why it's so important to get history right. He's musing about an issue which in his day was unresolved. And for people who are interested in the history of ideas, it's a fascinating one. In Jefferson's day, there was a lively debate among philosophers and others about so-called monogenesis and polygenesis. This was a debate about whether or not the races, which everyone knew by then that there were these different races that existed, and of course, they knew that there were different races, but nobody knew if all the races were related or not, or if they had different origins. And this, so the monogenesis argument was actually everyone is from the same origins, and the polygenesis was no, we must be from different origins. Now, the interesting thing about this, by the way, is it's fascinating for people studying, as I say, the way in which people tried to get to truths historically. The polygenesis people had all sorts of troubles on their hands. I mean, among others, if you read some literature on them, they're in such a mess. For instance, they have to work out if there's a white Adam and Eve, it must mean there's a black Adam and Eve, and a Native American Adam and Eve, and a Chinese Adam and Eve, and then that means there's got to be lots of Edens. And how did that work? Why didn't the Bible tell us? They get into a terrible mess over this. Anyhow, the point is that this was an unresolved question. It really wasn't solved until the 19th century. So again, it's not Jefferson's fault that he's still in this position of thinking these things over. But this is what he says to his friend in 1785. He says, I believe the Indian, which means a Native American, he says, I believe the Indian to be in body and mind equal to the white man. I have supposed the black man in his present state might not be so, but it would be hazardous to affirm that, equally cultivated for a few generations, he would not become so. Now, that's a very interesting passing remark in a letter of Thomas Jefferson's to a friend. He's saying, I don't know, because we don't have the evidence in front of us, but it seems to me that if you give everybody the same opportunities, we come out the same. Now, that seems obvious to us in the 2020s. It was so far from obvious in the 1780s. And I just found it absolutely extraordinary that Kennedy was doing a drive-by shooting on Thomas Jefferson's reputation, using a letter that actually speaks pretty well of Jefferson. But, as I repeat, this seems to me to be a pattern in our time, and one that all of you who are students are going to have to find a way to address. The pattern of people not being willing to contest ideas. And I mention this because it gets to an absolutely central thing of the Western tradition of free thought, free inquiry, and free speech, and that's this. It's that you get all of the ideas out, have them all out, because it's the only way you will get to truth. The only way you can get to truth is if you have all of the ideas out there. The two greatest texts, I think, in the Western canon on free speech, I would say, I'm sort of bored of books about free speech. We've had John Stuart Mill for 2 centuries now. And to my mind, it's almost everything. But Mill and Milton, among others, Milton in the Areopagitica, which is actually about the printing press, about the right to print. He addressed a lot of this in the 17th century. John Stuart Mill in the 19th century addresses the same issues in his wonderful On Liberty, which if any students who are interested in this and haven't read, I much urge you to read, just because apart from anything else, Mill's prose is just beautiful. Addressed a lot of this in the 17th century. John Stuart Mill in the 19th century addresses the same issues in his wonderful On Liberty, which if any students who are interested in this and haven't read, I much urge you to read, just because apart from anything else, Mill's prose is just beautiful. But Mill lands on what has been, until I think the current age, pretty much agreed upon as the system of free thought, free speech in the West, which is that you have to hear contrary opinions to the ones you hold, and you have to have them out and debate them and much more. for several reasons, but they boil down to these two things. The first is that issue that it's the only way to get to truth, because the other person who has an opinion you might not want to hear might be correct. And it is for your own interest the best thing possible that you hear that as soon as possible. And if they're not correct in full, they may be correct in part. But the second defense of Mill's of free speech, in a way, is even more important, which is he says that the person who is wrong must be heard, and the most harm it can do you is that you will know your own argument better.